Hey, thank you, Alex. So, welcome everybody. Hi, my name is Brett Likens. I run product here at OpsMill. Come from a network engineering, network automation background. Been doing this for, networking for 17, almost 18 years now. Focused full time on automation for the last 10 to 12 years. So going to kind of take you through first what we're going to talk about today and then dive in. I'm not planning to hit you to death with slides. If you need anything, again, please don't hesitate to use the QA panel. And somebody will be able to answer, either myself, I'll see it, or someone else. We've got some other folks from OpsMill on to help out. As well as if I'm going too quickly or anything like that, please feel free to ask a question, to have me go back, show something. Want to make sure I leave a lot of time for us at the end for questions as well. But don't hesitate to ask throughout as we go. One of the things you'll see, we always like so you'll see it actually on the first slide here. We had our mascot otter. One of the things that everyone gets is their own otter. So there's my OpsMill otter there. So you'll see different ones sprinkled throughout here. I like to use it where I can. So today for our agenda, I'm going to kind of talk about the basics of what Infrahub is and kind of give an overview of how it fits into an event-driven automation solution and what we're going to do with it today. And then kind of talk about the building blocks of how we're going to get to a solution that is reactive in that way, that's event-driven. And talk about the elements that come into play, and then basically dive into a demo that kind of stitches all of these things together. We'll kind of start from the basics and build up. So there may be things that a lot of you already know, there may be things you don't know, but kind of just trying to build a full path from essentially downloading Infrahub and going from there of what you would do as an example. So again, ask any questions you have as we go here. So first, let's talk about what Infrahub is. And so for those of you who aren't familiar, or even if you have, just to refresh, Infrahub sits at a point to be sort of an infrastructure as code and data management platform. So what that means in practical terms is a way to bring together the information and the things you need to automate infrastructure in your environment, whether it's servers, whether it's network equipment, basically you name it. The ability to both document and then automate against things that you've documented is what it's bringing to the table. And it's not just about network devices, it can be any number of things. And we'll kind of go into how and why that works in a little bit here. But the idea is really that it takes some of the existing concepts that are out there in the market around source of truth, around things like that, and brings it to that next step of where we want to go as an industry to solve the problems that a lot of us here at OpsMill, we come from a practitioner background. We've done this, it's day-to-day job. And this is about building the tool that we wish we had, those kind of things. So and taking a look at what are the components of Infrahub and how is it built together. So it starts off with a unified storage engine that kind of brings together a lot of different aspects. Traditionally you could keep everything in a Postgres database. You could keep everything in Git about the information about your environment. Kind of put the best of both worlds together. You can actually keep files in Git where they belong. You can have the data in a database and bring those together with a flexible schema that allows you to say how you want that to look and what you want the definition of the data to look like. So on top of that, writing atop of that unified storage engine, which again is all version controlled, the idea being that if you need to know what did happen or who did it, things like that, that's all in there. You can roll back in the concept of you can look and see what was there, put it back in place in the future, those kind of things. It's also able to take that data and generate what we call artifacts. So the idea is that the actual config for a network device, it's the, textual config for a Cisco device or whatever. It could also be, files to feed into Ansible. It can be Terraform, formatted files for Terraform to consume. It's essentially any kind of output from the data. So taking the raw data of, using a network device, this has an interface, it has this IP address, making that be something that makes sense to the network device and doing it in the system with the data. The other side of this then is what we call generators, where not everything needs to be put in there by hand. Sometimes you need to be able to actually programmatically generate things and say, when I create this device in this site, also make these 5 other sub devices. I've made a firewall device with a new site on it, also make the switch and 2 other things that go behind it for a site. Whatever you want to do with that, generators allow you to sort of dynamically control the data in the system. The other part of this that really ties together workflow oriented view on this and how we would the things that I looked for when I was doing this is the ability to have peer review of the changes. So one of the things people love about Git is the concept that it has the CI pipeline for testing, or any of the Git tools, GitLab, GitHub, they have CI pipelines attached to it, and you can do peer review on, yes, I want to merge this, or I think there should be changes, don't merge this, those kind of things. We apply that to Infrahub in the data itself. So you can actually have a branch off of the main grouping of data, propose some changes, and I can send it over. I can send it to Wim or Alex and say, hey, take a look at this change. Does that look good to you? They can say yes, and then I can bring that data into the system to make that be the actual main data representing the environment. And so having that built into the one platform really brings a lot of capabilities that aren't there in a lot of other tools. And then accessing all of that, you have a lot of different options. There's a web UI because it's a web-based tool. You go in, click around. There's also a REST API for managing the data in the system itself, or managing the system itself rather, getting artifacts and things like that out after they've been created. And then there's a GraphQL API that's natively built in for managing the data itself in the system and the schema of that data. So it's that way. It's very much more geared towards how people are thinking about using their data today, and it's getting a lot of the power that's native to GraphQL APIs versus REST APIs. That's native there out of the box, and it's kind of the way we think about this platform is all very GraphQL driven. So when we talk about what that looks like in comparison to other options and ways to document and automate your environment, Infrahub sits at a point where it kind of checks a lot of the boxes of things that, I would be looking for, that we've looked for in other similar situations. So I've used GitOps to do full control of network equipment and servers and things, and you get a lot of that version control capability. There's immutability where you can see what has happened in the past. But you have to create your schema. You have to tell it how this functions, what it does. There's frameworks that people use, but there's nothing out of the box that you could put anything you want into Git. And it's the interface itself is geared towards code, not towards infrastructure operations. So, it comes with some lacking things there. Similarly, I've been places where we've built our own, source of truth system, infrastructure automation system, and it comes to both the maintenance and management costs, but also then, most of those are not built with the version control capabilities or any of that immutable data tracking, the graph database capabilities that are underlying Infrahub today. And then a lot of existing tools in the market don't check those boxes either. And their schema flexibility is very much more limited with, you get the data model as it stands, and you can have custom attributes to that data model, but you can't fully control it. The underlying fundamental concept in Infrahub is that you are in charge of how your data is represented and stored in the system. And it feeds forward into a lot of things that we're going to explore today and we'll talk about in more detail. So we're going to start jumping back and forth between slides here and over in an actual live environment to do some demo. We'll talk about some of the building blocks. We'll go start some things off, and we'll come back and go from there. So talking about that flexible schema that we were describing. So for my mind, it's one of the really key strengths to how Infrahub solves the problem it's trying to solve. And what the screenshot on the right here of is an example of the demo schema loaded into an environment. And I have full control over what is a device. A device has these kind of attributes. I can control whether they're optional or not, all those kind of things. And that's for everything in the system, circuits, autonomous systems. If an AS number can just be a number in some systems as an attribute on something else, but here's a full-fledged object, I can do whatever I want with that. And so there's pros and cons to that people will bring up. They're like, that's flexibility is great, but flexibility comes with complexity or challenges in terms of understanding what you want to do and knowing what you want to do. And so our goal is not to sort of like kick you out of the airplane with a parachute and say good luck. So we have demo versions of, we have a schema library that kind of shows some really, standard example ways to model things that are sort of industry standard, as well as we have a demo instance that kind of shows how those things tie together. For today's webinar, we're going to use that demo instance and the demo schema and data in there as sort of the jump off point to do some custom things ourselves. But you don't have to use that if you don't want to. I mean, we joke that you could use Infrahub to model anything. It could be a fantastic, real estate app showing houses instead of network devices. It's not what we're trying to do, but you get the idea of how flexible you can be with this and how far you can take some of these concepts to meet what you need, because everyone's environment is different in some ways, and everyone's environment is the same in some ways. And where that line falls in any given organization can be very different. And the idea in Infrahub is that you know where that line is. You know what is the same between your environment and everyone else's. You know what is different between your environment and everyone else's. And we allow you to kind of choose where to divide that and how to say, I don't need to create a schema for an interface. Interfaces are interfaces to me. I'm going to use the standard one, but maybe I want to do something custom with the way that I represent VLANs because they're tied to something else internally, some business logic that I want to wrap up in that. And you can do that. That's an example. There's lots of ways that becomes power to what you want to do. So what we're going to do here is kind of a couple of quick steps of this. And I'm going to go over and launch this and come back because this can take a minute in the background. But essentially, I'm going to pull down the Infrahub Git, which I've already done, so I don't have to watch that process. Create a development override, Docker Compose override file here to sort of expose the port so that I can actually get to the Infrahub app, and then kick off the build process here of loading the data into it and then checking that out. So again, any point, ask any questions. I'm going to jump over and we'll get into that process. So what we want to do now is get into, pull down the latest version, and I'm going to copy development. So basically, I'll show what this file looks like when it's done here. And if I look at what's in that file, it's really just exposing the server itself on port 8000 on this machine. And so now I can come in, I can do invoke demo.start, and it's going to go through and pull and build the actual constituent components of Infrahub. And the app itself, it's built in Python. There's a lot of different components, and this is going to kind of work through building all those different things. There's some task workers for the back end work that happens to communicate, do the changes and things. There's a core database container there. There's a few different things that it's going to go through and build. Once it's built, we'll go over and take a look at the system as it would be blank, and then we'll load in the data and we'll kind of go from there for it. So one of the things that, a lot of people the questions we get sometimes is, I tried to run Infrahub on my laptop and it didn't work very well, or I was running it under a server under my desk, it didn't work very well, or something like that. So the idea of some of the power that this brings with it, that it is an enterprise grade application. So in this instance, I'm not running this on my laptop. I'm launching this in my lab environment where there's also some virtual switches and routers running and things like that. So you do have to provide it with, a fair amount of resources. You can run it on a laptop. Just don't expect to run it in production on a laptop, if that makes sense. So it's going through and creating those right now. One of the things that we're going to do from here, if we take a look at what comes next. So the idea is really that once we have our environment, we're going to have to populate it with data. And so the idea is, how do we do that? And so there's a couple different ways to get your data in there. You can go through and click in the web UI. We have a Python SDK, which is what we're going to kind of demonstrate today. There's a program called Infrahub Sync, so that can actually perform that sort of programmatically as a data sync between different systems. And there's Ansible collection. There's an Ansible collection that you can do that with. We're going to dive into Ansible for some other things later on, but today I just wanted to showcase this. I've got a script that's going to import my lab devices into the system so we can kind of have those there to go through. All right, so that's there. If I look at invoke demo.status, you can see those servers are running. The server is running, all the different containers are there. And I can actually now go over to the environment and open it up here. So this is a blank instance of Infrahub as it would come. Let me zoom in here. A blank instance of Infrahub as it would come sort of out of the box. The default username and password on these is admin and Infrahub. And one of the things I want to do here with this blank instance, just so that I have it for in a little bit, is go ahead and make an API token for myself. So one of the things we'll need is an API token. Have it expire at the end of this week, and it is a super admin token. So there we go, and save. Now copy this out. Come on, copy. And put it into the environment right now. So I'm gonna go over here, export Infrahub. So that it's here and I don't lose it. And while I'm at it, just export the server URL. So those are in the environment. One thing I'll also need to do, so we'll take a look at some of the code we're running here. Doing things that you don't do in an actual environment. These secrets are in plain text, but I didn't want to have us sit here and watch Ansible Vault all day. So there are, and we're going to share the example repo after we're done here. But the tokens just here in plain text for this purpose don't actually do that. So back over here, next step, we're going to go ahead and invoke demo.load infra schema. And we're going to have it go through and basically bring in the schema that describes sort of a demo environment for us. And that can take a minute there, so I'll let that run and we'll go back over to our presentation. So don't need that. So back over here, kind of talking about what is event-driven automation. So one of the things that is sort of buzzwordy in some cases, and one of the things that we want to, make sure that we're all using the same, meaning the same things when we say something like this together. So for this purpose, we're talking about the capability to really react and respond to changes and events in the environment. So that can be something that manually is triggered as an event. I can go in and make a change in a system and that triggers some things downstream. That can be in response to something coming from a monitoring system. It's really about being able to let automation be the thing that is consistent, that's repeatable, that is, effective at making changes to your environment. Something that you always need to do. If A happens, then B. Don't have a person doing B if you don't have to. And a lot of times people take this and it feels like an overwhelming concept. Like, I can't do that for everything. Well, you don't need to do that for everything. Just like you don't need to start by trying to automate everything. You start with something small and you add and you add. And so what we're going to do today is really going to be a very basic example, but it's to sort of firm up the concepts and allow us to take a look at what that would be going forward. So EDA, or event-driven automation, or event-driven Ansible, there's also a piece of the larger Ansible automation platform from Red Hat and IBM that is called the EDA server. And we're not going to do too much with that today. We're going to take a component of that and we'll dive into some more details in a minute, because the full EDA server setup is quite large, should be kind of beyond the scope of what we're trying to do here. But when you get into using it in a production enterprise environment, you would want some of that additional things it brings. It allows you to orchestrate more different instances of the event-driven portion of the system. But yeah, so you'll see event-driven Ansible in different places in the wild. That's talking about this concept of having a component of their larger automation platform that responds to events. And one of the things that I've run into in the past is people trying to do some of this on their own. They're like, well, if it's just something listening to a webhook and then doing something, I can write that myself. And you probably could, but a lot of cases, why reinvent the wheel? Especially with if you're already using something like you're already using Ansible playbooks, sticking in that environment gives you some capabilities that you wouldn't have to, you'd have to recreate to rewrite yourself. Um, and so even if you aren't using Ansible playbooks, in some cases, I've actually used the Ansible Rulebook runner to launch Python scripts instead. And so things that just needed to happen because it was a very easy webhook listener that had a good, robust rule set. And we'll dive into what that looks like in a little bit here. So let's take a look back at how our build is going. So we've created all of our schema in the environment so we can actually see now that there's data in here that wasn't before. There's not such, let me take that back. There are items in the menu that weren't there before. The data's not in there yet. So now it knows what a device is, but there's no devices. So the next step here, I'm going to come and tell it to load the data for the demo. So again, this is all something that if you download the Git repo, these commands are in there. This is nothing I'm doing just for this. This is standard run-of-the-mill how you can get an instance of Infrahub up and running to take a look at. When you go to demo.infrahub.app, this is essentially what's happening in the background to produce the web server that's out there. So yeah, so this is going to go through and it's going to populate some sample data for us there. So when we're talking through, continuing on with our talk about sort of event-driven automation and what we mean there, today we're going to focus keenly on Ansible for that. And again, some of this may be obviously things people know already. Some of this may just be, you just want to make sure everyone has a level set and somebody watching this for the first time has some breadcrumbs if they have no idea what I'm talking about. So Ansible is an automation tool and framework. It's written in Python. It's open source. Through a long chain of events, it's part of Red Hat and then IBM now. But the idea really is that it allows people to start automating things based off of a sort of given platform and framework of automation. So there's a large community around that. It was in use in servers for several years before it really took off on the networking side of things, because it was originally intended to be something that ran on the remote machine, and that's obviously a problem with a lot of network devices. You aren't able to do that. And so fairly recently, they've gotten a lot better at sort of how that functions. And so the Python code or whatever it's running is executed locally against the remote network devices. And so in this example, we're going to be making some changes, doing some things with the network devices that are in my lab. And we'll be doing that with Ansible. And again, so the goal of a platform like Ansible is some of that standardization and lowering the barrier to entry. I mean, there can be debatable things. I'm always up for the Ansible versus Python or Go or Rust conversation. I've had to do all of them, all of the above at different points in my career. So I think that it has a very good place in something like this where you want to talk about standardization, you want to talk about repeatability and something that's part of a larger ecosystem. And so that's what Ansible is going to give us in this example, because in addition to just the Ansible capability to run what they call playbooks, which are I'm going to do things, I'm going to do tasks to something on the network, it also has the larger concept of event-driven, Ansible and the event-driven server. So the EDA server, similar to how Ansible traditionally has playbooks to do things, EDA has rule books that tell it how to do those things or when to do those things. So you can set up rule books, and we'll show some examples in a minute, that really dive into responding to webhook events. So there's all kinds of different EDA things that are built into the library for that, the collection for that. Today, we're going to focus on the webhook listener, but there are other things that it can do because there are many ways in an environment where events can get to a system like this. And so again, there's a larger platform, and I'll show an example on the next page of what that kind of looks like. For our example, we're going to focus specifically on Ansible Rulebook, the application, because it's sort of the heart of the EDA server, and it's a lot easier to grasp and run in the small scale. Like if you're doing this to start with and you want to do something that's listening to 5 or 6 different possible webhooks and running 5 or 6 different possible playbooks, you can do that just with the native Ansible Rulebook app. Where it starts to become really necessary for the larger scale EDA server is if you're doing this, trying to scale up and doing this at an enterprise scale where you're doing thousands of different webhooks that take thousands of different actions. You want something like EDA service sort of orchestrating that larger scope. But again, for what we're doing, we don't need all of that. So this is an example of what it kind of looks like given the larger scope of tying into the Ansible automation platform, AWX/Tower, whatever you want to think about it as, and all of the components. EDA controller is just one of those. And so this is far too much for an hour for us to cover with the focus on a whole lot of other things. So we're just going to kind of take the component that rides between the controller and the execution nodes itself, and that's Ansible Rulebook, the application. And so we'll show that here in just a second. So let's take a look at our device creation. It's trucking along here, probably just about done. And one of the things we'll see if we go look at here now, if I refresh this, there are, sorry, actually refresh it. There are now devices in here. So we've got a fair number of our demo devices. You can see there's attributes and things that are tied to that. Again, this is very similar to what you might see in other infrastructure management source of truth systems. The idea again here is that all of this was user defined. I can actually come and say, what a device is, what kind of attributes it has. For example, in this, there's a computed description of it that kind of brings together a couple fields to make a description that's programmatic in that way. I can define what relationships it has. Is it one-to-many? Is it one-to-one? To all sorts of different things. And so this is where that flexible schema power comes in. All right, let's see here. So that's finishing up. While that's finishing up, we'll take a look at, so one of the things that's not in this demo environment is my personal lab. And so what I'll need to do is kind of tell it about my lab devices. And there's a couple of ways, like I said, you can go about importing that. I'm using our SDK to essentially push the devices in via the SDK. I could create them via Ansible. I could go to the web UI. I could do all of those things. I don't have to go about it that way. I can certainly just do it this way. So I'm just going to run this script, and I'll take a quick pass through of what we're doing. But this is a script I put together in a half hour to kind of throw these things in there. The SDK itself is fairly straightforward in that way. It allows you to interact with the things in Infrahub. So for example, I'm bringing in the Infrahub sync client. There's an async client for doing things sort of in production at scale. I'm using just the synchronous client because, again, this is just a demo and I'm putting in 2 devices. So I don't need to be asynchronous here and in parallel. So create the client, tell it about my Infrahub instance, give it the token, and then you could actually start to get, so if I want to create a site, so I'm in Washington, D.C., I want to create the IAD site for D.C., I actually need to tell it what country it is. So I go and get the reference to the United States, bring that object in and put it as the parent of that location. Again, that's something I've defined in my schema, that a location, a site, is part of a country. You can control those kind of things in how you want to define that. Since I know that I need a country, a location like that inside for a site, I can tell it about that, then create that and save the data. So a lot of the things you'll see is kind of a repeated in that process of, I'm going to tell it to create the object for that and then save it. Across the board, I'm using upsert, allow upsert to be true. The idea being, if you're not familiar with what an upsert is, it's the combination of an update and an insert. So if the object exists, it's going to try to update it with the values I'm giving it. If it doesn't exist, it's going to create it. You can use that in different situations in different ways. I'm using that here just because in my testing, I'd created them sometimes and all that. So we'll get that. So yeah, I'm going to create the site, create an org. So I've got my Mega Awesome Corp. And then I've got my ASN for my Mega Awesome Corp. And then I've got some IP addresses I'm creating in the IPAM. I've got some tags that I'm assigning to the devices that I'm going to create. It's for the webinar. These are my lab devices. And then I've got the details for the lab devices. And here's again where I'm referencing the things that I've already created to create the relationships and create the data around that device. So what's the primary address of it? I'm going and getting the IPAM object for that address. What tags? I'm using the tags I just made. What ASN? I'm using the ASN I just made. Those kind of things. And then similarly creating those. And then once I've created the devices, I'm going to put some interfaces on there. I'm going to give each of them one interface. They have some more, but these are the interfaces we're going to be doing some things with in a little bit. So I'll create those interfaces, assign those addresses, save that. So I'm going to go ahead and run this script for us. Here, yep, so that finished loading all the other data. Come back in here, Python, port lab devices. And so here's where we like are the demo gods smiling on us? And they are. So it's just going through the process of creating the site, creating the ASN, creating the IP address. This is not something that's been written for speed, so it takes a couple seconds there because I just really wanted to show the example of how each of those things function. But yeah, so that's created those devices now in the system. And if I go back over and look at device management, look at my devices, I can actually see, yes, there's an IAD device. I can similarly come up here, type IAD, and see my IAD devices. The other way that you can really see some of this data is one of the things that's in some of the newer features for us is in our activity logs, you have a really detailed view of what happened here and who did it. So you can see the script finished creating its things, and then I started a few minutes after, created the IAD site, created a few different things. So you can see that. You can actually go in and view details around what happened, what were the attributes that changed, what relationships changed. If there's an activity that triggered other things along the way, you can see that here. This is all really relevant because what is this but an event? And so what we're going to do in a little bit is take some actions based on these events, these activities in the system here, and the data that's available to us and what we can do with that. So now we've got our information in the system. Let's take a look. Let's pivot a little bit to talk some more about Ansible. So got everything created that we wanted to create. And we're going to talk actually now about what's our scenario that we're working through. So in this scenario, we've got oops, sorry, we've got all strange, it's still sharing. Okay. In this scenario, sort of, we've got a provider that's performing some maintenance upstream of our two routers. So whatever the fiber is that these two parts of this paths or this path that these circuits are running on, it's going some maintenance tonight. So tonight I want to shut down gig 01 on both of these devices. Again, picking something very, very simple, something I could manually go and do, or I could even have a script that goes and does that for me, but tying it together with the concept of based on some actions I'm going to take in Infrahub, then doing these things. Again, it's all about the building blocks and the starting simple and going somewhere with it. This is not a complex environment. It's not a complex change, but complexity comes later once you have a lot of these basic things functioning. So just getting some of this functioning to this point can take a lot of work, but it all builds on itself. It's all iterative. So again, goal is this provider's doing maintenance that's affecting this path in the middle, and I want to down those two links by changing it in the system, shuts down the two links, turn back on the system, brings up the two links. Again, that can be tied into other components of a larger system. Like I don't have to manually go change it in the system. I could have something automatically change it in the system. But again, using that as an example for the building blocks that really bring everyone to where they want to be. So taking a step back now, let's get back out of here. So if I look at, we're talking Ansible again. So if I look at, I'm going to show you kind of, we've got the secrets file. I've got some things in there. My super secure username and password for the devices is Cisco. Don't tell anybody. Again, use an actual Ansible vault for these things in production, but it's just easier if you can see it now and I don't have to mess with that. And so one of the things that, say I've already done in this environment is I've got a playbook that can come in and change interface status. And maybe I'm running this manually, and I'll show that here in a second, where I'm coming in and I'm saying for the devices in IAD, change the interface based on the variable that came in. And so we'll show this here in a second. And one of the things that we look at is, so how does it know what this is? Well, that's where then we're using Infrahub as the inventory source, and we start to get to that integration. So I don't have to define a static host file in Ansible. I can just tell it about the environment here, and it can come and get the data out of the system, the things that I just put in, and turn that into something that Ansible can use. And so if I go look now, move over to the right directory, If I look now at Ansible inventory and I look at, all right, this environment got wonky. Oh, I see what happened. Hang on one second. So that's the live demo messing for. The environment wasn't activated. So now I can come and I can run just the inventory check to see, can I talk to Infrahub? Am I getting data from Infrahub? And I am. I can see all the things that I asked it for in the inventory. There's groups based on site. There's groups based on country. There's, all the things that I asked it for. And here are my two lab devices showing up in there. So the ones I created for IAD, the CE1 and 2, they're both in the environment. So Ansible is now able to get to Infrahub, parse it for an inventory, and actually display it there. And again, that's all based on giving it the API token that I had previously created in the system and pointing it at that and having using the Opsml Infrahub Ansible collection to do that. There's a couple ways to go about getting that. The most easy in this example that we're doing in the PyProject TOML file, poetry is kind of defined that it needs these things. And then I'm actually doing an Ansible Galaxy collection install for Opsml Infrahub as well. So when I get started in this environment, it's actually Ansible Galaxy collection install. I need the EDA one, which it should come involved in installed already in some environments, and then Opsml Infrahub. So those are things that would already be there in this instance, but you may need to run to install those. Our Ansible documentation, our Ansible collection documentation sort of details all of those steps. So if I go to the Infrahub docs and go to the Ansible collection, it's got information on getting started about exactly the commands that I just ran, how to install it, how to use it, as well as then kind of what we're seeing here with how to use it as a dynamic inventory source. Similarly, I did the SDK to create those devices. I could come in and use Ansible to create those devices just as easy. It's, six of one, half dozen of another, what fits into your workflow and your environment, what you're familiar with doing. I'm a lot more familiar with using Python than I am with Ansible at the large scale, because I've done many more years of just writing raw Python. So that's why I threw together that script really quick. But if you're an Ansible person that's thinks in Ansible, you can use the Ansible collection for that as well. So once we have all of that there, we have the inventory. I've now written, we go back and say, okay, I've written a playbook that can do the things to change the interfaces. Let's check that that works. So if I manually am doing that, Ansible playbook. So I'm telling it, for gigabit Ethernet 01, it should be shut down. I'm going to shut it down tonight. I feed it the playbook file, and let's make sure that it can do the things that I want it to do. And so it's going out to those devices, and I think they're already shut down. I can double check here in a second. They should be. If they're not shut down, it's going to shut it down. Okay, they were up, so it changed them to shut down, and it'll show you what commands it ran, show you the, sorry, wrong interface, Yep, show you the interface status afterwards, so the before and after of the shutdown on that, and I shut down the interface to Provider Edge. Gig01 did that for both of my CE devices in that environment. So this playbook works. And so again, this is kind of as you're building these things, that's the iterative steps you'd go through. I know the playbook works. Great. So now the next step is, how do I do that with a webhook? So one of the things that we talked about was, again, Ansible Rulebook. And so playbooks are pretty straightforward. A lot of folks have exposure to what Ansible playbooks look like now. I'm not going to dive too deep into that. But the rulebook structure is sort of similar, but there's some key things to pay attention to in here. Things that can trip you up the first time if you're not know to look for them. So in this, you have full control over similar things like you do in the playbook. You can configure your hosts. You configure what sources you're looking for events from. In this case, I'm using the Webhook plugin. I'm running it on all ports on the server. I'm listening on port 5001, and I'm telling it to listen on /webhooks and to look for posts. And then I give it a token from the environment in the secrets file. Again, this is a super secret token. Ansible testing, don't tell anyone. It knows about that there. And similarly, in any source of webhooks, aka in Infrahub, or if I'm doing it from curl, like I'll demonstrate in a second, you would give it the same token so that you can have that secure secret between the webhook environment. Now, the other key portion of an Ansible rulebook is the rules. And so what you set in here is what conditions you want to match on. This is where the conditional logic of what you're doing and what you do when you see it comes into play. So in this case, I'm watching for a payload and I'm watching for the value of action in the payload of telling me what to do, admin status change. Similarly, maybe I have some other playbooks that I want to run, and there's this action of create VLAN. Again, these are user defined. So I define the structure of this and the payload. Everything from payload on of dot action is my arbitrary definition. You could call that, you know, you could call that field whatever you want, use whatever value from the playbook or from the payload that's coming from your webhook that you want. So once you've defined what you're looking for, so you're looking for an event from the webhook listener, and you're looking at the payload to see whether it contains action equals admin status change. If it does, it'll match this rule. And then you tell it what action you want to take. In this case, I just want to run a playbook. I'm going to run the playbook that I previously had written. So, I know that that playbook works. I'm going to run it programmatically when the webhook gets what it's looking for. And one of the gotchas to know as well is any variables that the playbook needs to know about, you have to define in the rulebook. So if I want the playbook to know the interface name, I want it to know, whatever things that I want it to know about, the username, the password, the Infrahub token, so the inventory functions, I have to pass in to the playbook execution, because the Ansible rulebook sits there and listens for the webhook and then basically launches a runner environment to perform the playbook actions. And so again, at scale with an EDA server, you can do that with the EVDA server that orchestrates this across a large scale. We're just going to run this locally with the Ansible Rulebook application, and the runner will run automatically in the background. So in this environment, I've already installed Ansible Rulebook. And so if I come here now and I do Ansible Rulebook, and so I want to run my webinar rulebook, I'm going to feed it the inventory file that I'm using, and again, the secrets file that's there. So now it's going to launch the webhook listener. And so it goes through some starting actions there. And I can actually test this now. So I can come over here and I can do curl to that URL. So I'm just sending a post to that URL, that path, using my super secure password there. And I'm telling it, this interface, this is the action. And so it's going to go ahead and accept that and kick off the playbook. And we can actually watch that if I go back in time. There we go. So it received the webhook. It shows that in the logs, and it knows what it needs to do from there. It says, okay, I'm going to kick off that playbook, and it goes through and runs the playbook that we just ran manually. So in this case now, I had told it, hey, turn those interfaces back up. It went through, it ran the playbook that turned those interfaces back up. So you start to build and build and build on those concepts. Now, the last step to sort of tie this all together would be, sure, I've got a webhook listener running. Sure, I could just send a curl to it, but if I'm doing that, why don't I just run the playbook? Now is actually coming over and creating a webhook in the system. So again, I'm using a sorry, what I called it. I'm using the SDK to create it just for sake of time. But again, I'm creating the client, feeding it some data, and actually giving it the information that we just had to give it before. What's the URL for it? What kind of events are we going to take action on? Let me create this and I'll show it to you in the system really quick here. The script was called create webhook. Oh, I'm in the wrong tab. That's why that's not working. Sorry. Okay. All right, so it created my webhook for me. And if I come over and now look in the environment, I can tell that it did it because I can look and see I created a webhook named Cisco Interface Status Change. And if I look at that webhook, it's in there. It's watching the default branch in the environment for all event types. Just for our purpose, you can narrow that down to a specific event if you want to have Infrahub only send a webhook for a specific event. And I'm watching for all events specifically on Infra Interface L3. So I'm changing that kind of object. And so that's where I want to look. And again, it's going to send it to my endpoint. got that password, and I'm not validating certificates because I'm using an HTTP endpoint. So similarly here, I could actually come in now to find that interface. And in the system, let's do it this way. Device is any of, and okay. And so I can come into that interface, edit it, and uncheck enabled to shut it off there. So you can save that. And so now if I look in the activity log, I look at the activities, I've updated that interface with a status change. One of the other things that's happening now is it's running out, sending a webhook to my webhook listener to take that action. So similarly, we'll now see it go through and change the interface to down. Not going to make you watch that process again, but they can go back to the interface when I'm done with whatever maintenance I'm doing. I can come in and turn it back to enabled. And so again, it's going to register that in the system as an event, and then it's going to come over to the task and it's going to run. Well, it failed. Live demos are amazing. It's running, it's going to submit that flow, and it's running the flow for sending a webhook to the interface status change. So we now have that ability to programmatically launch the playbook, have something waiting and ready to listen and launch the playbook, and do that based off of changes in here. And now this is still me going in manually, but you could then integrate this with something else. Like I have something that's looking at maintenance notifications or whatever other things in the system that exist, and have it change the status in here and then take effect. Similarly, I'm not going to go through all of the examples of it, but you can also come in and have it, if it sees a certain event, post a webhook over to Ansible that there's a new config for the device, and Ansible is going to fetch that config artifact and apply it to the device. There's sort of anything that you were doing in the system, you can use then to trigger those kind of actions and to trigger those events on the backside. So sort of to bring it all back around together, just double check here. So ideally, again, I'll just leave it on this for now. We'll go to questions. So the idea really is taking the capabilities of, not just what's in Infrahub and what's in Ansible, but bringing that together and being able to say, yes, I can use Ansible to make this change, but let's make that orchestrated in some way and programmatic. And then now let's have Infrahub send that event over to trigger that based on my changes in Infrahub. And again, this is purposefully a very simple example to showcase the basic constructs there. The idea is you can build on that, you can do all of that. And so what we'll do here after the webinar, we'll make sure the Git repo with those example files is published, as well as the steps to kind of get to the same point, with the idea being that you can follow along and do these things by just downloading the Git repo, running the demo environment, running the scripts to get yourself to that same point there.